Okay. Again, I'm Jennifer Heiselman. I'm the InfoNet Manager here at the Authority. I also have with me my colleague, Dr. Carl Gershow, who is the InfoNet Research Analyst and joined our team in January. And he may be jumping in today from time to time, and we'll be doing trainings in the future. So today we're going to go over InfoNet's Funding for Staff utility, which arguably is probably the most complicated feature in InfoNet, largely because the grant process is pretty complicated in and of itself, especially when you have staff that are funded with multiple funding sources, and all those funding sources and grants have all these rules attached to them. It can be really difficult, challenging to say the least, to try and figure out how to set up a staff person in your funding for staff statement in a way that accurately represents what those grant dollars are paying for. We have all the attendees on mute today, but you feel free to ask a question using the chat box. You should see some controls in the bottom of the meeting. One of them looks like a little balloon, and if you click on that, you should be able to enter any questions in the chat. Carl's going to be monitoring that for me, and we will answer questions as they come up. So let's get started. Okay, so the purpose of funding for staff. The main point of this utility is it allows you to produce InfoNet reports that display grant-specific data, and this is required for all the funding sources that are coming through ICASA. ICASA also will require you to submit a copy of your July 1 statement, or the very first statement for fiscal year 20. You can also use funding for staff if you wanted to compile data for other funders you may have, for grants that don't necessarily come through ICASA, but through other funding sources. I think the Attorney General's Office VCBA grants are a good example. I believe they do require you to report not what your total program does, but just what those VCBA dollars pay for. And funding for staff will help you compile that information a lot more easily. You can also use it to measure the different impacts of all your grants. And also, many directors use it to look at all the grants they're receiving from ICASA and other sources and try to identify gaps or redundancies in those funding streams. So to give you a more concrete example of what funding for staff does, we have two examples here of an InfoNet report. The top report shows what data would look like without any funding filter. So you can see those numbers are higher. In the top example, it shows that nearly 500 clients were served. We have just under 3,600 service contacts and close to 2,500 hours of service in that report. Whereas the bottom example shows that same program's data with a VOCA advocacy counseling filter on it. You can see it highlighted or marked in the box there. And when you look at the same row of data, those numbers are substantially lower. So this is a way for you to identify exactly what those dollars are paying for that come from the VOCA Advocacy Counseling Grant. You can see that the victims are cut roughly in about half, and the service hours are now just under 900. So this tells you that of all your program activity, that VOCA grant helps you provide services to nearly half of your client base, and I would say roughly about a third of your total service hours. These are the funding sources or grants that you are required to track using InfoNet's Funding for Staff page. Not all of you receive all of these grants, so don't be alarmed if you don't receive all 7 of these. These are just the 7 funding streams that come through ICASA, and whichever one of these grants you receive, you are required to include these funding sources in your funding statement. And this is a very good checklist to have as far as what information you want to have in front of you when you're working with funding for staff. It's going to make your life a lot easier when you have all this information in front of you. You know, some of these are obvious, some of them not so obvious. Names of staff and volunteers, and you may be wondering, why would a volunteer be on a funding for staff statement? They're not paid, and the best example I can think of is for a paid volunteer coordinator position. If that volunteer coordinator is funded with a grant, you're going to want the volunteers that coordinator position oversees and recruits to be included on a data report. How each staff is paid, and by that we mean how their salary is funded. You don't necessarily need to know the dollar amounts of their salary, but you do need to know which grants support their salary and in what portion. So for example, I am funded 75% of my salary comes from VOCA, and the other 25% of my salary comes from VAWA. So you'll need to know that same information for your staff that you're working in funding for staff with. You'll need to know, obviously, which services are and are not fundable with each of the grants that you're working with. You'll need to know effective dates with regard to staff. That would mean their start and termination dates, or a date that a particular funding source became active. And then this last point is probably the piece of information most often not considered when working for funding for staff. And we'll show you some examples of how that can negatively impact your statement and the information you're writing later. But you want to have a general idea of how staff spend their time, specifically their service time. Okay, so now we're going to get into how the page and the tools in InfoNet actually work. So at this point, I am going to get out of the PowerPoint and share my screen so you can see what happens live. And I am going to log into InfoNet's training site. This is a dummy site that all of you can feel free to access yourselves. None of the data in this center are real, and the username is SATrain. The password is also SATrain to log into the site, but you need to, the SATrain is all capital letters. Okay. So I'm going to log into our training center. And when I first log into InfoNet, to get to my Funding for Staff page, I want to click this little settings button at the top here, and then Funding for Staff. And this will take me to the most recent or the current statement date. And I want to clarify my use of the term statements. I've been around a long time, and so I've always used the term funding statement. What I also mean is a funding date here. And I believe ICASA uses the term funding statement as well, so hopefully that you're familiar with that. But I don't believe the word statement is actually anywhere in InfoNet. And is it in the manual, Carl? Do we use the term funding statement?
It is in the manual. I believe we have somewhere in our change list to change some of the verbiage on the screen.
Okay.
That has not gone through yet. But suffice to say, date issued funding for staff statements are kind of synonymous.
Yes, yes. So here we see on the screen our funding statement for March 25th of 2009. that is the most recent statement. If I want to view earlier statements, all I need to do is click on this drop-down arrow, and I can see all my funding statements from prior time periods. You won't need to do that very often, but you can certainly view statements from other time periods. If you need to review something earlier in the fiscal year, you would just click on the other date and it will bring you to that funding statement. Now, one common mistake we see in working for funding for staff is if you have any changes you want to make to your funding, the first thing you want to do is add a date that represents the date that whatever changes you're making are most effective or became effective.
And you'll notice here when we mouse over add for date issued, it says click to create a new funding statement.
Yes, okay, so we see the word statement. So if I don't do this, any changes I make to this funding information, let me also clarify, this page we're looking at is showing all these services assigned to staff person Sharon Bartolomoli. And if I want to see other staff, I simply click this drop-down menu and I can see all the different staff that are tied to my March 25th funding statement. If I click these arrows, I can see how each service is funded. So right now I'm still looking at Sharon's funding information, and this is telling me that for all the time Sharon spends doing criminal justice advocacy, this is telling me that the VOCA Advocacy Counseling Grant pays for 100% of that time. If I want to see other staff and their funding, now I'm on Jennifer Heiselman. If I click any one of these services, I can see that Jennifer's time spent doing family counseling, half of those hours are being paid for by DHS, and the other 50% is funded with VOCA. So that's how to see the information in funding for staff. And again, let's say I need to make changes in Jennifer's funding. Maybe she was 50% DHS funded and 50% VOCA funded at one point in time, and now that funding has shifted and maybe now she's 100% VOCA funded. If I go ahead and make changes, it's going to make these changes effective going back to March 25th. And if that shift in funding did not occur on this date, then I'm going to be messing up correct data. So you always want to make sure that before you make changes, you want to click this add button. It's going to ask you for a new date. And we are now in fiscal year 20, so I'm going to add a new statement date for 7/1/20. And then I will save. Oops, it's not 2020 yet. It's fiscal year 20, but it's actually still 19. So it's calling me out on that. Now, I just created a new statement date. It brought all the staff and the services and all that funding information that I had entered on March 25th, brought all that information forward to my July 1 statement. So at this point, all I need to do is make any changes that are different as opposed to the most previous statement or March 25th. So when do you want to add a new statement date? Basically, there are 4 scenarios where you're going to want to add a new date. One is pretty obvious. If there's staff turnover, if Sharon resigns and you hire a new person in that place, you're going to want to create a new funding statement date for the date that new staff person started. You'll also want to create a new date if you've had a shift in how your staff are funded, like the example I gave previously, where a staff person may have been funded 50 with a DHS grant and the other half with a VOCA grant, and on a certain date you change how that staff person is funded. You're going to want to create a new date on the same date that change becomes effective. You will also want to add a new date if there's been a substantial shift in how staff generally spend their time. Maybe somebody was spending all of their time as a counselor, and you've decided to shift that staff person's responsibilities so that now maybe they're only spending about half of their time working on counseling clients and then the other half of time doing something different. In those cases, and if it is affecting your funding, meaning it's the shift in their responsibilities is something that was maybe restricted according to their new funding, you're going to want to add a new date on the day those responsibilities actually shifted. And then finally, you are always going to want to add a new statement date every July 1st. Even if there have been no changes in staff or funding, everything's exactly the same, you're still going to want to add a new statement date for July 1st every year. And you'll be very happy you did this if you ever make a mistake in the future and you have to retroactively correct information for a fiscal year. You'll save yourself a lot of trouble and frustration when you have a statement date every July 1st. And I think ICASA requires you to do this also. So there shouldn't be anybody that does not have a statement on July 1.
As well, another thing about making a statement at least every July 1, besides being required, as we'll get into later, this also becomes critical for if you do have to change something or made a mistake. It's kind of like an insurance policy that you only have to go back so far to fix the mistake.
Right. Okay, so now we'll show you how to edit staff. So I can click on this staff drop-down menu and I can see I have about 7 or 8 staff listed on my statement. So to change, to add or remove staff from my statement, I'm going to want to click this Edit Staff List button. And this is going to give me a list of all the staff that are active during my statement date. So remember, my statement date is July 1, 2009. This is a list of all my personnel who have a start date that's before July 1, and they don't have a termination date. So it's all active staff on July 1st. And to remove staff, I can simply uncheck their name, and then I can add whatever new staff I want to link, and then I'm going to click Save. So I've removed Snow White and I've added Erica Hughes. And so after I've saved my information, my staff drop-down menu now shows Erica Hughes as a staff person, and we no longer see Snow White. So that is how you change the staff that are linked to your particular statement. A common question we receive is, you're trying to add somebody to your statement and you don't see that person's name anywhere in that list. The most common reason why that might be the case is this person, there's 2 reasons actually. One, that person may not even be entered as a personnel in InfoNet. So you want to make sure that's the case. So let's say I'm trying to add Carl Gruchot as a staff. Do I see his name on this list? It lists all of my staff who are on the statement first, and then all the staff who are not on the statement alphabetically. So if I scroll down to my G's, I do not see any name for Carl Gruchot. So what could be causing that? First, I want to look in my personnel information, and I can get there by also clicking on the settings button, going to personnel information, and I'm going to see if Carl is listed as a personnel. And he is, but look at this. His start date is listed as 7/24/2009. So going back to my funding statement, The reason why InfoNet is not letting me add Carl Groucho is because he didn't start until July 24th. Well, this statement is effective July 1. So if I want to add Carl Groucho to my funding statement, I'm going to need to add a new statement date for July 24th. Then it will let me add him. Okay, so how do I assign services to staff? Let's click the person. Who did we just add? Erica Hughes. Okay, so we just added Erica. How do we assign services to Erica? I'm going to click this Assign Services button, and that will show all the available services. Services that are direct to clients are shaded this pale yellow color. And then all the other services that are more community and institutional services are shaded blue, if some of you are wondering about why the different colors. And then anonymous crisis intervention is its own pink shade down there. So to add services for Erica, I'm simply going to check all the services that she's going to be doing, and then save. Okay, so now you can see I've added services for Erica, but where it says percent, it all says 0. And it says 0 because I have not added any information as for what grants or funding sources are going to pay for these services that Erica provides. So I can do that in 2 ways. The first way is to click any one of these arrows. You would click the arrow for the service you want to add funding to. So I just clicked the arrow for Anonymous Crisis Intervention to add a funding source. I'm just going to click this button. And I'm going to go through all my possible funding sources. And I'm going to say that Erica's Anonymous Crisis Intervention Services, we're going to have United Way pay for that. If you have more than one funding source pay for a service, it's trying to make sure that your funding sources add up to 100%. So it's going to put 100 in there by default, but you can manually change that to whatever percentage is appropriate. So I've changed it to 75, and that means I need to make some other funding source pay for the remaining 25% of her service time. So when I'm done, I just click Save. And then you'll see that Anonymous Crisis Intervention is now funded. You're only going to see 2 numbers here. You'll either see a 0 or a 100. InfoNet's not going to let you save information where a service is not 100% funded. So when I click the arrow, it shows the 2 funding sources I have assigned to pay for Anonymous Crisis Intervention in the same percentages that I had entered. Now, if somebody provides a lot of services, you can see how this can take a long time. So a more efficient way to assign funding for services is to use this MultiFund Assignment button. And you should use this button when you have multiple services that are funded in the same way. If a different grant is going to pay for all of these services, then yes, you'll have to do it one by one. But in most cases, services are sharing funding information. So if I click MultiFund Assignment, I will be able to assign funding to multiple services at one time. So let's say for Erica's counseling services, they are all going to be funded in the same way. And I'm going to tie all her funding source or counseling services to the VOCA Advocacy Counseling Grant. So when I check VOCA Advocacy Counseling, it's going to put 100 in there. I'm going to have VOCA pay for 100% of the counseling services, but if there were multiple funding sources, I could assign additional grants in the percentages I want as well. So after saving that information, I can see by clicking here, all of the counseling services are now being paid for by VOCA. Okay. One shortcut I want to show you, and this will come in handy when you are when a staff person resigns and then you hire another staff person to replace that former position. So let's say I've just hired Erica and I'm going to assign services to Erica. Let's pretend that I haven't done any of this yet. If Erica is replacing the same position of a previous staff who has left, I can use this match services for field up here. And if I click here, and let's say Julia Dean has resigned, and Erica is going to be doing all the same work that Julia Dean had done previously, and her funding is going to work the same way. I can just select Julia Dean's name here, and then I'm going to save, and that's it. I am done. Now it assigns all the same funding information that Julia Dean had, and I'm going to check on her name just to double check. Julia did 2 services, and it looks like her counseling was funded with VOCA, and her training law enforcement is funded by DHS. Well, if I go to Erica's name, my new staff, you can see that all the funding information was linked to her in the same way. So this is a handy shortcut. In order to use this, you do want to remember that whenever you are adding a new staff that's replacing somebody who has resigned, when you use this edit staff list, the tendency may be, well, you know, Erica's my new staff and I'm going to uncheck Julia Dean, but you don't want to do that just yet. You first want to add the new staff, leave your former staff in place, because if you do that, then you can see you'll be able to use that former staff's name in this match services for shortcut. Okay, so that is how to add staff, dates, services, and funding. These are pretty much the mechanics behind the funding for staff page and how it works. There are reports within funding for staff, because you can see with any one statement, if you want to get a full picture of a statement, you can see it's a lot of clicking around. You'll have to, you know, now we're looking at Sharon's information, and to see all of Sharon's information, we have to click on her services. If I want to see another staff, I have to click on her name. So to save you some time, to give you more information at a glance, you want to use these handy little reports, and there are 4 of them. If I click selected funding, that will give me the funding information for all the staff tied to my statement date. So this is giving me all the staff for the July 1 date. I can see all my staff, and I can simply scroll down to see all that information. And these reports, you can save them as PDF files, making them easy to share and print. So let's say I need to look at an entire, maybe I'm just interested in one staff. That would be the staff selected funding report. I had Jennifer Heiselman's name. You can see I'm viewing Jennifer Heiselman's name here. So when I tell InfoNet to run a staff selected funding report, it's going to run a funding report on the staff that's on the screen at that point in time. Now let's say you need to review a whole fiscal year of information. Then you're going to want to use one of these 2 history reports. Let's say I need to look at Jennifer's history for FY19. I'm going to want to select staff funding history. Then I'm going to want to check all the statement dates that were effective during FY19, and in this case, there's only 2 of them. And now it's going to give me all Jennifer's FY19 funding information. And I can do this same report for all staff by selecting the funding history report. I want to look at FY19. I again check the 2 statements I have that were effective during fiscal year 19, and it's going to give me the same report, but for all the staff linked to my funding statements throughout FY19. Okay, I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint, because now we're going to get into what I think most consider the more challenging part of funding for staff. It's not really knowing how to assign all this information into InfoNet. It's how do I know what percentages? So I'm going to, we had static screenshots just in case we weren't able to log into the live system. So I'm just going to toggle through these really quickly. These are just a couple. Okay, match services 4, we went over that. Funding sources with asterisks means they're not active anymore. So you won't, InfoNet should prevent you from being able to select them. But they're still there because you may want to view historic information. And then this is important. Let's say I realized today that I made an error throughout all of FY19, and I'm only catching it now. I don't just want to correct that error on my March 25th statement, because March 25th, 2019, that statement date is only showing funding information that's effective from that March date through the end of the fiscal year. I am also going to need to go back and edit my July 1, 2018 statement. So the nice thing about funding for staff is whatever error you make, however big of a mess you make, it's always correctable. So nothing is impossible to help to fix, and we can help you do that if you're unsure how to go about doing that. However, the longer you wait and the more statements that have been created since you recognize the error, it's just going to be more time consuming to correct that mistake. So again, you need to make sure that you are, if you find an error, you need to correct that error in all the statements that were active during the time that error was, that information was effective through the time that you recognized the error. Okay, so how do we know what percentages to enter into funding for staff? There is a formula that's very helpful, and it's very simple. It's a fraction, a simple division. The numerator, you want that to represent the portion of a particular grant that supports a person's salary, or how much of a staff person's salary is funded by that grant. And then the denominator is the estimated portion of time that staff person spends on that grant's fundable services. And we'll go through some examples that start out really easy and get progressively more difficult. Okay, so this is not something you would probably use the formula, because you would do this pretty much in your head, but I want to just show how the formula can apply in this example. So this is the most simple example we're starting with. We have 2 pie charts here on the left side of the slide. The top one represents this staff person's salary. This staff person, 100% of their salary comes from VOCA. So that's what the blue pie chart represents. In the bottom portion, that pie chart represents generally how that person spends their time. And this shows that about 70% of their time is spent on work related to in-person counseling, and then roughly 30% of their time is spent doing phone counseling. So we're seeing 70-30. We want to know any restrictions, and in this case, there are no restrictions because VOCA does allow you to use those grant funds on both of these services that this person does. So that's a good thing. So when you apply the formula, you will come out with 100%, and that tells you that for both the services this staff person provides, you're going to, in your funding statement, you're going to link both of those services to VOCA, and VOCA is going to pay for 100% of those services. So to show the math behind that calculation, here's my numerator. 100% of this person's salary comes from VOCA. Looking back at the pie chart, we know that this person, 100% of their time is VOCA eligible or VOCA fundable, because remember, she spent 30% of her time on phone counseling, the other 70% on in-person counseling. That's all of her time. So all of her time is VOCA fundable. So working out the formula, 100 over 100 is 1. Multiplied by 100, we have 100%. So this tells us that for both the services VOCA will pay for, you want to have VOCA pay for 100% of that service. Okay, so let's move on to something a little more difficult. In this case, we have somebody who's funded half with VOCA, half with DHS. That's what the 50% salary pie chart at the top left demonstrates. Then just below that, we have how this person spends their time, which is the exact same as in the previous example. 30% phone counseling and 70% in-person counseling. So when you apply the formula, it will tell you that for both counseling services, you want VOCA to pay for half of those, each of those services. And here's how the formula works out. And you want to apply the formula for one funding source at a time, and you always want to use the more restrictive grant first. I'm going to go back a little bit. We have VOCA and DHS as our two funding sources. VOCA we know is more restrictive than DHS. So we're always going to start with the more restrictive funding source, which is VOCA in this case. Again, the numerator, how much of this person's salary comes from VOCA. We know that's 50%. The denominator is how much of this person's time is VOCA fundable. Again, we know that's 100% because all this person does is two services, in-person and phone counseling. Both those services are VOCA fundable, so we know 100% of her time is also VOCA fundable or eligible. 50 divided by 100 is 0.5. Multiplied by 100, we have 50%. So this tells us that VOCA will pay for 50% of both the services this staff provides. And then there's only one other funding source. So you don't have to do the formula with your last funding source. You really just need to fill in the gaps. If VOCA pays for half of this person's in-person counseling service, we know DHS is the only other funding source, so that's going to pay for the other half. The same, and the same would be applied to phone counseling. Okay, so moving up with difficulty. Here's an example where the funding, or how this person is paid, is the same as in the previous example. 50% VOCA, 50% DHS. The time, how this person spends their time, looks a little different. 30% of this person's time is spent doing prevention work, and then the other 70% of their time is spent on in-person counseling. And just a note about staff, how they spend their time. I know that's really hard to do But you want to think over the long haul. It's challenging because one day can look completely different than the next, but you want to think like over months or even a year's worth of time. Generally, how much time does this person spend on the services that they're providing? And in this case, again, 70% counseling, 30% prevention. Now, here is our first example where we have a restriction. We know that VOCA pays for part of this person's salary. We also know that VOCA will not allow, we cannot use VOCA funds to pay for prevention work. So this is where the formula is going to come in handy. And when you do the formula, you are going to find that VOCA is you're going to want VOCA to pay for 71% of this person's in-person counseling service. And that may be confusing at now, but when you see the formula, hopefully it'll click a little better. So let's apply the numbers or plug in those numbers into our formula. And again, we're starting with the more restrictive funding source first, which is VOCA. The top portion represents what portion of this person's salary is supported by VOCA. We know they're half VOCA funded, so the numerator is going to be 50%. The denominator is what portion of this person's time is VOCA fundable. Well, we know that that's 70% because jumping back here to this previous slide, in the bottom left, 70% of her time is spent doing in-person counseling, and 30% is spent doing prevention, which is not VOCA fundable. That's why we are using 70% of her time as our numerator in the formula. And when we do the math, that comes out to 71.4%. You want to round to the nearest whole percent, and that tells you for the one VOCA fundable service the staff person provides, you're going to have VOCA pay for 71%. We know DHS is the only remaining grant that supports this person, so we're going to use DHS to fill in the gaps. That would mean 29% of the counseling will be paid for by DHS and 100% of this person's prevention work. So for a little more clarification on why this works, this pie chart it represents this person's salary by not only their services, but also by their funding source. And admittedly, this is challenging. This is the first funding for staff training I've ever done online. So I'm learning as I go. This was always done as a classroom training, so it's really hard for me to do this without a dry erase board. So please feel free to ask questions in the chat box as you have them. So we know VOCA pays for half of this person's salary, okay? So that's represented by the dark blue portion of this chart, 50%. We also know that this staff person spends about 70% of her time doing VOCA fundable work. So that would be represented by both the blue sheet, both the blue shades, the 50% and the 20%. Those add up to 70%, and that represents the staff person's time doing in-person counseling, or the fundable portion of her time with VOCA. So we're really talking about a portion of a portion, and that's why you don't want in-person counseling linked to, you don't want VOCA to only pay for half of this person's in-person counseling service, because she doesn't spend all of her time doing in-person counseling. She spends some of her time doing service that's not VOCA fundable. So if you look at that dark blue shade again, and you consider what portion of that half of the pie is with the 70%, that is that 50% is actually 71% of both the blue portion, or the total time spent doing in-person counseling. And when you line that up, that represents about half of this person's total time. And since VOCA pays half of this person's salary, it's on target with how that grant, how much in-person counseling activity is actually being paid for with that grant. Okay, maybe if you are confused, you're not alone. It takes a while for this to click. And I thought that maybe including this example might help understand why this would be the case. Because some people have a tendency to think, well, if VOCA only pays for half of my salary, I can't make VOCA pay for more than half of anyone's service. Yes, you can, and this is why. And actually, assigning your services in your funding statement that mirror how staff is paid is going to shortchange yourself, and this is why. This is a different example now. We have two pie charts. On the left, this is how a person is paid. Okay, they're 75% VOCA funded, 25% DHS. On the right side, we're seeing how this person generally spends their time. Okay, so this person spends 3/4 of their time doing criminal justice advocacy. The other quarter of their time is spent training police officers. We know that's not VOCA fundable. So here is the incorrect way and the correct way to do this. And again, this is the most common oversight we see in your funding statements. When you don't apply the formula, your statement might look like what it does on the left side of the screen. The tendency is to mirror how the staff person is paid. If the person is paid, if their salary is supported 75% with VOCA and 1/4 with DHS, there's a tendency to link those same proportions to all the staff person's services. But how it should be done is on the right side. You want VOCA to pay for all of their criminal justice advocacy service. You want them to pay for all, you want DHS to pay for all of their law enforcement training, because VOCA doesn't pay for training police officers. So if you do have your statement set up the way it is on the left side, there's going to be two major consequences. First, if you have VOCA paying for 75% of your law enforcement training, that activity is going to show up on a report to your VOCA monitor, and it's going to look like you're using VOCA dollars to conduct unallowable activities. So we certainly don't want that. The second problem is by only looking at the criminal justice advocacy service, if you only link VOCA to pay for 3/4 of that, you are shortchanging yourself, because this person spends about 3/4 of their time doing criminal justice advocacy. So therefore, it's okay to have VOCA pay for all of that time, even though VOCA only supports 3/4 of her salary, because she only spends 3/4 of her time doing fundable work. So you don't want to have unallowable activities show up on your report. You also don't want to shortchange yourself or underrepresent what the grant is actually paying for. So hopefully that made it a little more clear as to why you don't necessarily want to just mirror how a staff person's salary is paid. So this is our last example. In this case, this person's salary is funded 65% with DHS, 35% with VOCA prevention. Okay, and we know there's a restriction. VOCA prevention money will only pay for prevention services. It won't pay for direct services. So when we look on the right side and look at how this person is generally spending their time, it looks like only 20% of their time is spent doing prevention work, while the other 80% of their time is on counseling activities. So let's try to plug those numbers into our formula. And again, we're going to start with the more restrictive grant first, which is VOCA prevention. So if our numerator is 35, because we know 35% of this person's salary comes from VOCA, but look at what portion of her time is allowable under VOCA. It's only 20%. So that is going to give us a number greater than 1, and that puts us in a quandary. When you apply the formula, that means, and it comes out to a number that's greater than 100% or greater than 1. That means that the portion of this person's salary is paying for more time than they do allowable work under that grant. So if you find yourself in this situation, you're going to want to consider doing one or two things. If I'm funding my staff, if I'm having this VOCA prevention grant pay for over a third or 35% of my staff's salary, but they're only spending 20% of their time doing prevention work, I might want to think about telling that staff person, okay, they need to increase the amount of time they spend on prevention activities, and that minimally needs to be at 35%. My other option is I can say to myself, well, this person only spends about 20% of their time doing prevention work, so I am only going to support this person's salary. I'm only going to have my VOCA grant support 20% of this person's salary. That would have you on target with the grants and making sure that you're only doing the allowable work with that money. So those would be the two options you'd want to consider. And we want to open it up. Have we had any questions so far?
Not since the audio portion. If you have any questions, type them into the chat window. Usually if you're looking, you might see like a side pane, or you might have to press some of the circle buttons when you're at the bottom of the screen to open up the chat or the Q&A. If you type something in, an example might be a good case, like if you have something from your own organization and you want to work through it interactively, that'd be great.
If a question comes to you at a later point, we'd like you to send that to cja.infonethelp@illinois.gov, which is this address right here. This webinar has also been recorded, and we will make that available within the InfoNet system within the next week.
Hillary has one question. Okay, can you explain why DHS would not have been assigned to fund a portion of the CJA? Which?
Yes. So it's example, okay, so the question is, why did we not have DHS pay for some of the criminal justice advocacy work? And the reason why is because if we go back to how this person spends their time, this person, their salary, 3/4 of it comes from VOCA. This person also spends 3/4 of her time doing criminal justice advocacy. She spends the other 1/4 of her time training police officers. We cannot use VOCA dollars to pay for this person's time training law enforcement. So if we did have DHS pay for some of the criminal justice advocacy, then we would be shortchanging VOCA, because we want VOCA to pay for 75% of her time, right? Because that's what funds her salary. 75% of her salary comes from VOCA, so we'd like VOCA to pay for 75% of her time. We can't use VOCA for a whole quarter of her time, so we have to use VOCA to pay for all of the criminal justice advocacy. I hope that helps. But it's a lot harder to do without having a dry erase board where I can actually like draw and do some of the math that's behind this. So I hope that helps.
There was a thank you to that. So,
okay.
Another question, when will this be on the website? It'll be on the website within about a week, hopefully sooner. It just takes a couple of days to get it from, it has to go between a few teams, get it down from WebEx, double check that audio works, etc., and then post it to the web. It takes a little bit, but it'll be there soon. And eventually, probably not immediately for this one, but as we go through these and start catching up on the backlog of training, we will probably have a space similar to where the manuals are when you log into the VPN to go view the training videos. That'll take a little bit while, so maybe more like months for that. But for this one, in a week or so, we should have a video up.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Okay, well, it's just about 10:30, so we will be signing off. And again, if you have questions about funding for staff or this webinar or anything at all, you can send it to cja.infonethelp@illinois.gov, and you can also call our main line at 312-793-8550. Thank you all for listening, and have a great day.